Okay, we're going to talk about some evidences that evolution occurs. These are some things that we've already sort of talked about a little bit, but we're going to talk about them a little bit more. In the fossil record is the first one that's the evidence of evolution. One big thing, of course, is the dinosaurs. You know, dinosaurs existed, they no longer exist today. And so that means that there used to be different kinds of organisms, and there's lots of examples of organisms that used to exist that no longer do, some prototypes for organisms that exist today. And of course, the fossil record isn't completely linear. That is, you don't see one development to the next development like the slow gradual change like you might expect. Sometimes there's big jumps. And one of the things that explains that is Hox genes. Hox genes are genes that are control genes. Those genes control whole body form. And there are 4 sets of Hox genes, for example, in vertebrates. And what that means is if I were to mutate or have a problem with one of the control genes, then that means that the body form that is dictated by that group of genes is going to be changed. So this is a way that evolution could happen in a really big way, in a very small difference. That is one mutation or one change. So that kind of explains at least some of the jumps. Other jumps have to do with the fact that, you know, the strata don't just stay in place. Rocks fall, things get heaved up and turned over, the sea wears it down, so weathering of rocks and things like that. And things are just not always exactly the way they were when they were put down. So there's a lot more to be said about that. You could take a whole class on paleontology, but that's enough for now. So anyway, the next one is adaptations do exist. That is, we see some really specialized features for the environment. But what's interesting is sometimes those features have evidences or remnants, or what we call vestigial structures that indicate that it was coming or used to have, or in another organism that's closely related would have a feature that, let's say, they lost or gained. So in this case, blind crayfish and caves, they have the ganglia for the eyes, but they just don't have the eyes. And they don't need them in caves because there's no light, so they can't really see them. And in terms of the amount of effort, in terms of time, energy, resources, the crayfish needs to make eyes, it's not worth the effort. If it happened that there was a mutation that allowed the crayfish not to have eyes, and that one did just as well as the other ones, then that mutation is going to stay in place. Another one is antibiotic resistance. What that means is you have, with antibiotics, if you take antibiotics and you don't take the whole round of antibiotics, then the ones that are left after a few days are the ones that are really not being affected by the antibiotics so much. And those guys are going to be the ones that are reproducing and making a whole group of them, because they reproduce asexually. And they will make a whole group of them that is now more resistant to that antibiotic. And if you keep doing that, then you're going to make some antibiotic resistant bacteria. So this happens, and that's why they have to come up with new antibiotics all the time. And so that's just an indication that, you know, there are adaptations. Another one is something we call comparative morphology. What this is talking about is morphology is related to body parts and body structure, really. And the homologies, which you will look at in the lab, are the bones that are in vertebrates. Most of the bones in vertebrates are very similar in terms of they have the same types of bones. However, so they have the same origin, but they don't necessarily have the same function. All right. So an example, I'll just show you quickly. Oops, if I can show you quickly. This is just an example of the bones that are in the human arm versus the bones in a cat arm versus a whale arm versus a bat. They all have the phalanges. They all have the metacarpals. so they're colored for you here. They all have the radius, which is the orange, and the ulna. So anyway, they all have the same features. They're just repositioned based on what the animal does in the environment. Swimming, flying, being, cat-like, that is creeping or walking on all four lightly, and grabbing. That's what we do. So this is a example of homologies. An analogy is also an indication of evolution, and the reason for that is this is a feature that has the same function but not necessarily the same origin. It has to do with if you have a particular need in the environment, your structure is going to be roughly the same, even though it might not be built the same in terms of origin. For example, a fly wing and a bird wing, they're both getting the organism around and enabling it to fly within its environment and to fill that ecological niche. But the fly wing is not made the same at all. It has chitin and it's got an exoskeleton, and the bird wing has bones, just like we were talking about in the bat and the human arm. So not the same origin, but the same function, but still it's indicating that evolution is making the wing a useful function for that organism. There's also molecular data, things like DNA having the same nucleotides or being copied the same, the replication process, the same thing with RNA. And ATP. ATP is used in every single organism for the same function, which is passing energy around, or energy currency. All right, so another one is what we call biogeography. This one has to do with if you have an original organism. This, by the way, is one of the handouts that I supplied for you in the group that you might want to have printed out. I'll put that on Canvas for you guys. My printer is not working very well, so you can see it's kind of strange. But anyway, on this side over here, these are all Australian continent animals and mammals. And these guys over here are all North American. So these are placentals. Or do I have that backwards? Let's see. I think I have that backwards. This is Australian, and this is North American, sorry. All right, so what they're trying to say here is that you have basically a root organism that gave rise to different kinds of organisms, and these organisms are filling certain ecological niches, and the ecological niche will require the same kinds of features. For example, the Tasmanian wolf versus the North American wolf. The cat-like organism, the mouse or squirrel-like organism, etc., on down the line. So this, in a way, is kind of like analogies. The same type of organism is going to be filling that ecological niche, but it's having to do more with where they are, as opposed to just a feature within their environment. So that's called biogeography. The last one that I want to talk about is the fact that an enormous number of species do exist. And we kind of briefly talked about this when we talked about dinosaurs, because dinosaurs, there was numerous types of dinosaurs, and in terms of numbers, there were many of them. And they all died out, and then other species came about. And so we've had these periods, if you look at this diagram, which I also supplied, you have these periods of extinction, big extinction, lots of organisms, dying out. And then you have a rise in organisms after. And these are all little extinctions. This is another big one. We're probably headed for another fairly large one. And so there have been these big extinctions over the past history, but still, if you look at it, and the number of organisms, and this one did number of families, not species, but the number of organisms has risen. And what this is telling you is there some process that is creating new species, new organisms as time goes by.